What if the greatest conqueror in history walked into Egypt expecting no resistance, but silently stepped around a kingdom of Black Pharaohs too powerful to ignore? For centuries, we were told the story of Alexander the Great as if he simply walked into Egypt, welcomed like a god, unchallenged, uncontested. But what if that story was only half the truth? South of Egypt, beyond the sands and silence, rose a kingdom forged in gold, fire, and faith. A place where pharaohs were black, and power wasn't just seized. It was earned, preserved, and worshipped. They ruled pyramids older than Egypt's last breath. They revived gods Egypt had forgotten, and their very existence was enough to make Alexander think twice. Why have we never heard of them? Why has history painted Egypt white while burying the truth in Nubian stone? This is not just a forgotten chapter. This is a battle for memory. And today, we begin to reclaim it. Let's uncover the lost legacy of the Black Pharaohs before the silence buries them again. You thought Egypt was easy for Alexander? Think again. Most of us grew up hearing the same tale. Alexander the Great marched into Egypt in 332 BC and was welcomed like a savior. No war, no resistance, no challenge, just open arms and smooth sands. Sounds too easy, doesn't it? History likes tidy stories, heroes who always win, victories that come without complication. But the truth? Egypt wasn't a void waiting to be conquered. It was a land layered with pain, pride, and power. And just beyond its southern border stood a kingdom that had ruled Egypt before, a kingdom that might have stood in Alexander's way, had he dared to face it. The kingdom of Kush, the land of Black Pharaohs. Why did no one mention them in your history books? Why are their names barely whispered in documentaries? Could it be that Alexander's conquest wasn't as absolute as we thought? That maybe, just maybe, there was a force he couldn't afford to fight? In the next chapter, we'll meet the rulers history try to forget and understand why their silence speaks louder than any sword. Who were the Black Pharaohs? They weren't outsiders. They weren't invaders. They were kings from the south, heirs to an ancient fire that never went out. The so-called Black Pharaohs were rulers of Egypt's 25th dynasty. But before they wore the crowns of the Nile, they ruled the kingdom of Kush, a land rooted in Nubian soil, bathed in gold and shaped by gods. Kush was more than just Egypt's neighbor. It was Egypt's mirror, a place where temples rose with the same devotion, where pyramids pierced the sky, and where royal blood ran as deep as the Nile itself. Pharaoh Piye was the first to reclaim Egypt not with brute force, but with a sacred mission. He saw Egypt not as a prize, but as a motherland in spiritual decay. Then came Taharqa, a warrior king who would stand against the Assyrians and be praised even in the Bible. Yes, that Bible. These rulers weren't just black kings in a whitewashed timeline. They were revivers of Egyptian soul, keepers of tradition, and symbols of a truth we were never taught. So why did we grow up thinking Egypt stopped at Cleopatra? Why has history painted every pharaoh with lighter skin, while the darker ones were erased? In the next chapter, we'll journey to the heart of Kush, a land with more pyramids than Egypt itself, and see the legacy these kings built in stone. Kush, the African power that flourished in Egypt's shadow. While Egypt stole the world's spotlight, Kush quietly built an empire in the shadows. But make no mistake, there was nothing quiet about its power. Tucked along the Nile's southern curve, in what is now Sudan, the kingdom of Kush rose from the ashes of old Egypt, not as a copy, but as a civilization entirely its own. They mined gold by the ton. They mastered ironwork, while others still fought with bronze. Their armies rode chariots into battle, draped in leopard skins, bearing shields of rawhide and resolve. And their cities? They shimmered. Meroe, the jewel of Kush, stood proud with wide avenues, bustling iron workshops, and over 200 pyramids, more than Egypt ever built, taller, narrower, and carved with symbols that sang of gods, ancestors, and eternal pride. These weren't tombs for the forgotten. They were monuments to memory. Yet how many of us have even heard the name Meroe? How many documentaries have dared to show these temples, still standing, defiant, under Sudan's blistering sun? Kush wasn't just surviving beneath Egypt's shadow. It was thriving, with its own script, its own queens, and a vision of power written in stone and blood. In the next chapter, we'll see how this thriving civilization turned back toward Egypt, not to conquer, but to restore, and how a king named Piye began a holy mission, to save the soul of a fallen land. The Nubian Renaissance, reclaiming Egypt with honor. Egypt was crumbling. The gods no longer heard the prayers. Temples were desecrated. Foreign rulers sat on the throne, but their hearts beat only for conquest, not for Kemet, the Black Land. To Piye, king of Kush, this wasn't just political decay. It was spiritual collapse. He didn't march north as a conqueror. He moved like a priest, a guardian, a son returning to rescue his mother. His army crossed the Nile like a rising tide. But when he reached Memphis, Egypt's great city, he didn't burn it. He didn't boast. He prayed. In the victory stele he left behind, one of the most poetic military records in history, he spoke not a triumph over man, but a restoring Ma'at, the sacred balance of life and order. Piye didn't just take a throne. He revived the soul. Temples reopened. Rituals returned. Art, language, and religion surged with new energy, not from foreign ambition, but from ancestral reverence. This was not colonization. It was resurrection. For a brief, brilliant time, Egypt and Kush breathed as one. Black Pharaohs didn't just wear the crown. They redefined what it meant to be pharaoh. But as this Nubian light shined, a new shadow loomed from the west. In the next chapter, we'll shift to 332 BC and ask, what did Alexander the Great really see? When he looked south, Alexander the Great, the invincible who looked south and paused. He swept through Persia like a storm, toppled cities, crushed empires, and in 332 BCE, he reached the sands of Egypt, the ancient land of pharaohs and pyramids. But what happened next was unexpected. No war, no resistance. The people hailed him as a liberator from Persian rule. Priests crowned him as a pharaoh. He built Alexandria and turned north again. Victory? Yes, but something doesn't quite add up, because Alexander was a military genius, a strategist obsessed with maps, terrain, intelligence. He didn't just look at the battlefield. He looked beyond it, and to Egypt south was Kush, a rising, black-ruled kingdom with gold, iron cavalry, and hundreds of pyramids, a dynasty that had ruled Egypt not long before, and could threaten to do so again. You think his spies didn't warn him? That no envoy whispered the Black Pharaohs whose blood still stirred in the south? He must have known. And still, he chose not to march south. Was it respect, caution, or the simple logic of a tactician who saw no gain in waking a sleeping lion? Because to conquer a people who still remember ruling isn't conquest. It's war without end. In the next chapter, we'll explore why Alexander, the man who challenged the known world, avoided Kush entirely, and what that silence really meant. Why there was no war between them. Alexander had never been afraid of war. From the mountains of Macedonia to the palaces of Persia, he faced down armies larger than his own, and won. So why did he stop at Egypt? Why not claim all of Africa? If the South was just desert and myths? Because it wasn't. Kush was real, powerful, unconquered. It wasn't just geography, it was geopolitics. To reach the heart of Kush, Alexander's army would have to march through brutal desert terrain, cross searing heat with little water, and face warriors who knew every rock, every bend of the Nile. And these weren't disorganized tribes. These were seasoned kingdoms, led by kings who traced their lineage back to the gods. Even the Persians, who once ruled half the world, had never broken Kush. There's a phrase in military strategy: don't fight a war you don't need to win. Alexander didn't need the South. He needed stability. Egypt to serve as a launch pad to Persia and India. Not another front. Not another fight. Maybe he planned to return. Maybe he feared rebellion in his absence. Or maybe he recognized the legacy of Kush as something best left untouched. Because some kingdoms don't fall. They endure by being too rooted, too sacred, too fierce to forget. In the next chapter, we'll see how that legacy, though buried, was never broken. A civilization whose whispers still echo in the stones. The erasure, why Western history forgot them. You've heard of Tutankhamun. You've heard of Ramses. You've seen Cleopatra played by white actresses with British accents. But have you ever heard the name Taharqa? Or seen the pyramids of Nuri in your textbooks? No, that's not an accident. History isn't just what happened. It's what got written down. And more importantly, who got to write it. When Europe rediscovered Egypt in the 19th century, they saw what they wanted to see. A civilization that looked classical, that could be claimed as part of their heritage. A white Egypt, a sanitized, stylized version where Africa was erased from its own greatness. The Kushites didn't fit that narrative. They were too black, too powerful, too inconvenient. And so they were buried again, not by sand, but by silence. Western scholars dismissed them as Ethiopian invaders. Hollywood ignored them. Museums tucked their artifacts in dark corners, unlabeled. Why? Because a black dynasty that ruled Egypt, built pyramids, and stood toe-to-toe with Alexander. Shatters everything colonial history tried to teach us. But silence is not forever. In the next chapter, we'll unearth the stones, scrolls, and skeletons that prove the Black Pharaohs were real, and their legacy is rising again. A legacy written in stone and sand. They tried to erase them. But how do you erase pyramids? How do you silence kings whose names are carved in granite, whose temples still echo chants beneath the desert wind? Across the Sudanese sands, you'll find the forgotten capital of Meroe, not in ruins, but in waiting. There, over 200 pyramids pierce the sky. Narrow, elegant, crowned with Nubian pride. Many are older than Rome, and yet barely anyone visits. Archaeologists are only now beginning to uncover what centuries of bias buried. Temples the gods once thought Egyptian, found deep in Nubia. Hieroglyphs and scripts written in Meroitic, a language still unsolved. Tombs of queens and generals, buried with gold, weapons, and sacred texts. In El Kuru, the burial site of the 25th Dynasty, archaeologists found murals painted in brilliant blues and reds, showing Black Pharaohs embraced by deities, surrounded by stars, welcomed into eternity. And science, too, has joined the chorus. DNA studies, bone analysis, and carbon dating confirm these were African kings, born of the Nile, guardians of a legacy older than empire. They didn't vanish. We just stopped looking. But the sand is shifting, and what's been hidden is ready to rise again. In the next chapter, we'll ask the deeper question: why does this story matter? Not just to historians, but to all of us? Why this story matters more than ever. This isn't just a history lesson. It's a mirror. For generations, people of African descent have been told, your greatness began with slavery. That power, architecture, empire belonged to someone else. That your ancestors were conquered, not conquerors. But what if that narrative was never true? What if it was built, stone by stone, to strip you of memory? The story of the Black Pharaohs challenges everything we were taught about civilization. It proves that power wore dark skin, that African kingdoms ruled with brilliance, spirituality, and strength. Long before Europe even dreamed of empire, it matters because representation is power. Because when a child learns about pharaohs who look like them, they no longer see themselves as afterthoughts in the human story. They see themselves at the center. This is more than reclaiming a dynasty. It's reclaiming dignity. It's unearthing a birthright buried not by time, but by intention. The world doesn't need more forgotten kings. It needs remembered truths. And the Black Pharaohs are a truth worth remembering. In the final chapter, we'll leave you with one question, one challenge, to carry this legacy forward. The truth is rising. Will you let it be forgotten again? Some stories fade with time. Others are pushed into silence. But silence isn't the same as absence. And the Black Pharaohs, they were never absent. They were warriors, priests, builders, visionaries. They ruled not in the margins, but from the throne of Egypt itself. They shaped culture, defended gods, and carved their names into stone that still stands today. Yet most people have never heard of them, and now you have. So what will you do with this truth? Will it stay a trivia fact, buried in your memory like the pyramids of Meroe? Or will it become a spark, a reason to dig deeper, to question louder, to reclaim what was lost? This story isn't over, because history isn't fixed. It's alive, changing every time we dare to look again. So if this moved you, share it. If this shook something inside you, talk about it. And if this challenged what you thought you knew, follow that curiosity. Because the Black Pharaohs weren't just kings. They were keepers of memory. And now, that memory is yours to carry.